Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Gagan Kumar, Associate Professor at Jindal Global Law School, OP Jindal University, India. I would like to warmly welcome everyone who has joined us for the second session of Nazariya Critical Dialogue series hosted by IDEAS, the Office of Interdisciplinary Studies. IDEAS is a novel initiative at Jindal which attempts to bring together scholars and researchers from different fields of social sciences and from different parts of the world. We at IDEAS not only promote cross pedagogical research, but also provide supportive environment and space for academic debates, reading, writing, develop frames of analysis, and help incubate ideas. We try to go beyond theorization and connect to research happening on the ground. By this collaboration, it is our attempt to advance and to be part of cutting edge research by building bridges between our university and international academic, civil institutions, policymakers, and think tanks. As part of this interdisciplinary research ecosystem, the politics, society, and history research constellation aims to further understand aims to further understanding on some of the unsettled debates in social sciences by using political, sociological, and historical lens. Focused on questions of politics of identity, our research intends to understand how lived social reality is constructed in the everyday and how it is communicated. This rainy afternoon, our research collective is very pleased to lead a discussion on Dr. Vanya Bhargav's recently published book by Penguin Random House India. The book is titled Being Hindu, Being Indian, Lala Lajpat Rai's Ideas of Nationhood. Dr. Vanya Bhargav is a historian of modern India. She has a DPhil in history from the University of Oxford. After a DPhil, she worked as a senior research fellow at Leipzig University, Germany, at Multiple Secularities, the Humanities Center for Advanced Studies, where her work primarily focused on the emergence of Indian secularism. Dr. Bhargav has published in various peer reviewed journals such as Global Intellectual History, Studies in Indian Politics and Religion, and Journal of Asian Studies. Being Hindu, Being Indian is her first book. Vanya, we are delighted to have you for your book discussion. We would also like to welcome Professor Sagnik Datta as the discussant for Vanya's book. Professor Datta is an associate professor at Jindal Global Law School. They have a PhD in politics and international studies from the University of Cambridge. Their research has appeared in several prestigious and peer reviewed journals in the field of gender studies and socio legal studies, such as feminist theory and ethnicities. I particularly remember the fascinating article on legal pluralism and gendered agency in Mumbai's area courts, published in Law and Social Inquiry. Thank you, Sagnik, for agreeing to discuss Vanya's book. Even though currently you are on research leave, you found time to come together. Professor Soumya Saxena was also supposed to join us as the second discussant, but is unable to join due to unavoidable circumstances. But she has sent us her questions, which I will read out after the author's presentation. I'll now invite Vanya for her presentation. This will be followed by Sagnik's discussion, after which we can have questions from the floor. Vanya, the floor is yours now.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Gagan. I obviously want to first thank the organizers, Gagan, Sagnik, Soumya, Kirti, whoever else was behind organizing this book discussion. I also want to thank the participants for joining. It's a pleasure to be given this opportunity to present my research in front of you all, and I look forward to our discussion afterwards. So yeah, I think I'll quickly start in the interest of time. In popular imagination, Lala Lajpat Rai is always linked to Bhagat Singh. It was to avenge Lajpat Rai's death that Bhagat Singh assassinated Saunders, an act for which he was hanged. Rai is remembered as a great leader who sacrificed his life for the nation. Many Indians also recall that Lajpat Rai, along with Bal Gangadhar Tilak and Bipin Chandra Pal, was part of the Lal Bal Pal trio of extremist leaders who, as opposed to moderates like Gopal Krishna Gokhale, who as opposed to Gopal Krishna Gokhale, advocated more radical confrontational methods to achieve self-government for India. But Lajpat Rai has also become known in another avatar as an ideological ancestor of Hindutva, the Hindu nationalist ideology elaborated by Vinayak Damodar Savarkar in his 1923 tract, Hindutva, Who is a Hindu? Proponents of Hindutva today make a clear and assertive claim on Lajpat Rai as one of their own. This is symbolized by Kiran Bedi, the BJP's chief ministerial candidate for Delhi, in the 2015 state election, putting her scarf around Lajpat Rai's statue in Delhi. It's also symbolized by the organizer, the RSS's weekly organ, paying homage to Lajpat Rai and claiming that he championed a politics more akin to its own rather than the anti-Hindu, pro-Muslim nationalism of the Indian National Congress. The Hindu nationalist ideological family sees Lala Lajpat Rai as one of the Hindu heroes neglected by the Congress and by secular historians. Interestingly, this Hindu nationalist claim on Lajpat Rai as their icon is confirmed by dominant interpretations of the man in historical scholarship. In the 1990s, with the rapid rise of the Sangh Parivar in Indian politics, historians and political scientists tried to understand the history of the origins and development of Hindu nationalism in India. In these histories, V.D. Savarkar and M.S. Kulwalkar are studied as the chief ideological founding fathers of the Hindu nationalist ideology. But Lajpat Rai too appears in these histories as part of Hindutva's prehistory. For instance, in Christoph Jaffrelow's pioneering research on Hindu nationalism, Lajpat Rai appears as a proto-Hindu nationalist who in 1909 articulated an earlier embryonic form of the ideology that Savarkar then fully developed in 1923. In his later work, Jaffrelov views Rai more boldly as playing a pivotal role in the birth of Hindu nationalism, an ideology later fine-tuned by Savarkar. Chetan Bhatt, another scholar of Hindu nationalism, similarly views Rai as articulating a Hindu nationalism with a strong continuity with Savarkar's Hindutva. This general impression of Lajpat Rai is also found in scholarship that deals with Rai only in a cursory manner. My argument is that this interpretation of Lajpat Rai ends up leaving out much nuance and complexity. I began to realize that something was amiss in our understanding when I chanced upon some writings and speeches which showed that Lajpat Rai supported the Khilafat movement led by Gandhi and a section of India's Muslim leadership. How is this supposed forefather of Hindutva supporting a movement in defense of an Islamic caliphate? Despite the strides we'd made over the decades in our understanding of Hindu nationalism, were we historians missing out some nuance and complexity? This must in some way be limiting our understanding of an ideological and political constellation which remains relevant to Indian politics and society today. The absence of a comprehensive study of Lajpat Rai's nationalist thought over different phases of his life has facilitated his evaluation as a predecessor of Savarkar. And this has cramped our understanding of the history of Hindu nationalism and nationalism in India in general. Being Hindu, Being Indian undertakes precisely such an examination of Lajpat Rai's nationalist thought over 4 different intellectual phases of his life, lived between the 1880s and 1928 when he died. In doing so, it contests dominant interpretations that iron out the intellectual shifts, fluidity, and complexity in Lajpat Rai's thought to evaluate him as Savarkar's precursor, either sharing deep ideological affinities with Hindutva or representing some nascent, softer variety of it. In this presentation, I will focus on Rai's second, third, and fourth phase. I argue that even when Lajpat Rai articulated his most robust Hindu nationalism in his second intellectual phase, it diverged from Savarkar's Hindutva in important ways. First, let's acknowledge where he overlapped with it. According to Savarkar, one had to meet 3 essentials to be part of the Hindu nation. For him, the only nation in India. First, one had to be born in and love the Indian fatherland. Second, one had to possess Hindu blood and be part of the so-called Hindu race. But for Savarkar, these remained insufficient criteria to belong to the Hindu nation. India's Muslims and Christians could be born in India and love it. And since Savarkar held that Muslims and Christians were descendants of Aryans who'd only converted to Islam and Christianity respectively, they supposedly even possessed Hindu blood. But they still couldn't be included by Savarkar into India's Hindu nation because they supposedly did not meet the third key essential of Hindutva, partaking in and revering Hindu culture, defined as the essence of India. In Savarkar's view, the majority of India's Christians and Muslims could not be included into the Hindu nation because they had supposedly disowned Hindu culture, which he defined as India's national cultural essence. In his 1909 speech to the Punjab Hindu Sabha, cited by scholars as evidence for Lajpat Rai's pivotal role in birthing the Hindu nationalism that eventually flowered into Hindutva, Rai articulated a strong notion of a Hindu nation. Rai argued that Hindus within whom he, like Savarkar, included Sikhs, Buddhists, and Jains, were a nation because they shared a common Hindu culture. In taking Hindu culture as the core of the Hindu nation and in including Sikhs, Buddhists, and Jains, but excluding Muslims and Christians from this nation, Lajpat Rai's Hindu nationalism converged with Savarkarite Hindutva. Lajpat Rai often viewed Hindus and Muslims as separate nationalities. His Hindu nationalism also shared Hindutva's view that the Hindu nation was crystallized in Hindu historical resistance to the foreign Muslim enemy. So why am I arguing that Rai's Hindu nationalism was distinct from Savarkar's Hindutva? Despite viewing Hindus and Muslims as separate nationalities, Rai imagined a friction-ridden yet politically cooperative relationship between these Hindu and Muslim nationalities within a common state. His ability to see the Muslim nation existing robustly alongside the Hindu nation was different from Savarkar's demand that to become part of the Hindu nation, Indian Muslims and Christians had to abandon their religion and cultures and assimilate into Hindu culture. Rai's Hindu nationalism did not require such religious abandonment or cultural assimilation from Muslims and Christians. It lacked Savarkarite Hindutva's desire for Hindu cultural supremacy and its aversion to religio-cultural diversity, and was marked by a basic respect for India's diversity. Unlike Hindutva, Rai's Hindu nationalism ultimately envisioned the eventual unification of the Hindu and Muslim nationalities into a broader Indian nation. To be sure, Rai's articulation of Hindu nationalism had a political dimension. Lajpat Rai saw members of the Hindu nation as having common interests that could require separate political organization. But even when Rai espoused this semi-political Hindu nationalism, when he used the term nation in the fully nationalist status political sense to mean a community that must govern and rule itself through a state of its own, Rai always referred to an Indian nation, including Hindus, Muslims, and other religious communities, and not a Hindu nation. Unless Muslims and Christians gave up their supposedly foreign religions and cultures and adopted Hindu culture, Savarkarite Hindutva refused to include them into the national fold and treated them as second-class citizens of an India that belonged to Hindus. This held true even though Savarkar made statements in the late 1930s about formally granting equal citizenship rights to Muslims. These statements have to be read alongside the fact that he never renounced Hindutva, which treated Hindu culture as the essence of India and demanded cultural assimilation from minorities in a manner that would establish Hindu cultural domination. Savarkar's statements indicating his willingness to grant minorities equal citizenship rights must also be read with his statements that India was the land of Hindus, as noted in the slogan Hindustan Hinduon Ka. In 1909, Lajpat Rai neither claimed that India belonged exclusively to Hindus, nor labored to link India exclusively or specially to Hindu culture. He didn't dream of Hindu supremacy, but instead found acceptable the idea of proportionate Muslim reservations. Rai's Hindu nationalism, of course, also diverged vastly from M.S. Golwalkar's Hindu nationalism, which wished to not give minorities even citizenship rights, envisioning them as living under complete Hindu domination. So Rai's articulations of Hindu nationalism may have been drawn upon by later Hindu nationalists, but this doesn't mean that Rai himself articulated the same kind of Hindu nationalism. Lajpat Rai's nationalism has to be understood independently of teleological ties to Savarkarite Hindutva. It was not the same as it, nor was it a softer variety of it. It was a different kind of Hindu nationalism that took for granted the existence of a Muslim nation in India, the eventual unification of Hindus and Muslims into a common Indian nation, which had a basic respect for India's religio-cultural diversity and did not dream of a future of Hindu supremacy. And then things get even more complex. Because by 1915, with the start of the third phase of Lajpat Rai's political life, Rai was singing a different tune. Till 1915, Rai shifted between using the term nation in its pre-nationalist sense to refer to a predominantly cultural community without connotations of statehood, and using the term nation in its full-fledged modern nationalist sense to mean a cultural community which must possess its own state. In this period, when the existence and entrenched realities of empires and an imperial world order was still largely taken for granted, Lajpat Rai had spoken of a Hindu nation in a pre-nationalist sense and an Indian nation in a nationalist sense. He shifted between the two senses and meanings of the term nation. But till 1915, he strongly prioritized strengthening the Hindu nation, articulated with the pre-nationalist sense of the term to simply connote a cultural community without connotations of statehood. For him, rightly or wrongly, the separate strengthening of the Hindu and Muslim nations was the essential prerequisite for building the future Indian nation. In his view, the Indian nation, in the modern nationalist political status sense, would be built by Hindus first strengthening the Hindu nation and Muslims the Muslim nation. By 1915, changes in personal, Indian, and global contexts irreversibly changed Rai's concept of nationhood. By this time, the First World War had broken out. Lajpat Rai was exiled in America, and the Muslim League and Congress were beginning to cooperate. What fundamentally changed Rai's concept of nationhood was the First World War, which seriously shook the givenness of the imperial world order. The logic that superior nations had the moral right to rule over other supposedly inferior nations gave way to an imagination of the world as consisting of equal self-governing nations. Lajpat Rai could now more vividly and realistically imagine nations as self-governing political formations. And he now began using the term nation firmly and consistently only in its fully nationalist political status sense to refer to a cultural community which needed to express itself in an independent state. As he made this firm and decisive shift, Rai also ceased to equate nations with religio-cultural communities, earlier signified by his references to Hindu and Muslim nations. He now decided that there existed only one nation in India and not more, and that this was the Indian nation, comprising India's various religious communities. Between 1915 and 1919, Lajpat Rai elaborated a richly textured nationalist narrative, firmly grounded in the notion that Hindus and Muslims constituted a single Indian nation. Lajpat Rai's shift towards using the term nation solely to describe a single cultural and political community, broader than and comprising India's diverse religious communities, was partly fueled by his changed geographical location. Having arrived in England as part of a Congress deputation in 1914, he had gotten stuck there after the outbreak of the First World War in the same year. He had then traveled to the United States, where he spent the next 5 years. With this new global lens, differences between Hindus and Muslims looked less significant. In America, Lajpat Rai also interacted with American progressive, liberal, and socialist intellectuals, some of whom held egalitarian and inclusive ideas. These may have encouraged Lajpat Rai's shift towards a new Indian nationalism, which saw Hindus and Muslims as sharing bonds of common Indian national belonging. But more than this, what seems to have encouraged Rai's shift were significant changes in the Indian and global political context. In India, this changed context was constituted by the political reorientation of India's Muslim leadership. The British government's actions within India between 1911 and 1913 had seriously embittered sections of India's Muslim leadership. This included its revocation of Bengal's partition, its refusal to accept a Muslim university at Aligarh without British control, and its mishandling of the Kanpur mosque affair, where the British government demolished the wuzu-khana of a mosque and then fired upon protesters. On top of that, Britain was approving of attacks on the Ottoman Empire by Italy and the Balkan states, and was also talking of partitioning the Ottoman Empire. This also upset some now politically ascendant sections of British India's Muslim leadership. Since the formal end of Mughal rule in India in the 19th century, and also coinciding with the political marginalization and colonization of Muslims, both globally and in India, several prominent Muslims had begun to articulate so-called pan-Islamic ideas about the existence of a global Muslim community united by a common Islamic civilization, with the Ottoman Caliph as Islam's spiritual head and the Ottoman Empire as its temporal embodiment. As Jamal Aydin argues, this had been their means to elevate their self-esteem in the context of European imperialist ideas about Muslim inferiority and Western superiority. The Ottoman Caliphate Empire was the symbol upon which Muslims drew to bolster their pride and confidence in this context of communal humiliation and political marginalization. Some Muslims also simply conceive paying allegiance to the Caliph as a matter of religious faith. And so, British actions in India and globally vis-a-vis the Ottoman Caliphate Empire led many emerging Indian Muslim leaders to question the Muslim League's policy of loyalism towards the British and aloofness from the Congress. This new generation of Muslim leadership sought greater collaboration between Hindus and Muslims. Lajpat Rai welcomed this changed political reorientation of the Indian Muslim leadership as ushering in the possibility of a new Indian nationalism upheld by Hindus and Muslims. He now reconfigured his own nationalist thought to firmly, confidently, and decisively shift towards reimagining Hindus and Muslims as members of a single Indian nation. It was once again the First World War which radically altered Rai's nationalist stance. It endowed Rai with a new internationalist perspective. It shook his assumptions about a morally superior Europe and enabled him to more confidently view and criticize British imperialism as tyrannical, exploitative, and criminal. The whole Eurocentric imperial world order was now seen by him as completely unjust and illegitimate. India was not a unique victim of British imperialism. Asia was a victim of European imperialism as a whole. The entire map of the world needed to be reconfigured to make the world order less hierarchical and more equal. Lajpat Rai now believed that Asia, led by Japan, needed to unite and rise up against European imperialism. He predicted that this pan-Asian movement would produce a revolution against the imperial world order and establish a new world order consisting of equal self-governing nations. Lajpat Rai latched onto Bolshevik rhetoric about the need for a world order based on equality and brotherhood, and then American President Woodrow Wilson's wartime rhetoric about a world order based on the principle of self-determination. From Rai's view, given that the world order needed a complete overhaul, and given that Indians needed to join the Asian struggle against European imperialism, Hindus and Muslims had to forget their religious differences and petty quarrels and unite with each other and with other Asian countries to smash European imperialism altogether. It was this that really kickstarted his reimagination of nationhood in India in 1915. In this period, Lajpat Rai still sometimes argued that India's Muslims belonged to the same Aryan race as Hindus and were touched as Hindus were by India's timeless Hindu culture. So he may have separated nationhood and religious community, but he sometimes defined India's distinctive culture in terms of Hindu culture. He seemed to sometimes deny that India's national culture, or even the culture of India's Muslims, had also been shaped by Islam. If the Hindu assumptions of Rai's wartime Indian nationalism make it a Hindu nationalism, this Hindu nationalism was again distinct from the Hindutva ideology Savarkar was conceptualizing during these years. Rai's wartime nationalism again lacked Savarkarite Hindutva's demand that Muslims and Christians must give up their supposedly foreign religions and cultures with their links to extraterritorial holy lands and assimilate into Hindu culture. Rather than desiring Hindu cultural homogeneity, Rai's nationalism sought to assert the indigeneity of India's Muslims and endow Hindus and Muslims with a sense of common belonging and a common ancestral community. Rather than constituting soft Hindutva, Rai's wartime nationalism practically accepted India's religio-cultural diversity. It was a non-assimilationist, diversity-accepting Hindu nationalism. In some writings, Lajpat Rai in fact went to great lengths to prove the common Indian nationhood of Hindus and Muslims by constructing for them a shared hybrid ancestry and a pluralist culture. He rejected the idea of Hindus and Muslims belonging to a common Aryan race and proclaimed that they belong to a common Aryan-Mongolian mixed race. He said, quote, "No Indian, Hindu or Mohammedan ever attaches any importance to his racial origin. The sons of man have so freely mixed and mingled in the past that racial distinctions are only a matter of imagination and conjecture. Hindus, Muslims, and Christians are all a racial mix-up. The Musliman descendants of Persian, Afghan, Turkmen, Mughal, and Arab invaders have a great deal of Aryan blood in their veins, and the Hindu descendants of the Aryans have a great deal of Mongolian blood." End quote. Rai's disinterest in cultural homogeneity is attested by his abandonment of the notion that Hindu culture was India's essence, and his desire that both Hindu and Muslim festivals be celebrated as Indian national festivals, and that Indians should be proud of Hali, Iqbal, and Mohani, as well as of Tagore, Roy, and Harish Chandra. "We are proud," he said, of Sir Syed Ahmad Khan, as well as of Ram Mohan Roy and Dayanand. Lajpat Rai explicitly wished that India's public national culture be fashioned as a pluralist blend of the best elements of Hinduism and Islam and of Hindu and Muslim cultures. This cultural pluralism was also manifest in his suggestion that Hindustani in both scripts be India's national language. Lajpat Rai also attempted to accommodate India's religious diversity by asserting that Hindus and Muslims constituted a nation simply because they desired to be one. Finally, inspired by America, he suggested federalism as a solution to India's religio-cultural diversity. Given the presence of Muslim-majority provinces in India, such as Punjab, Bengal, and the Northwest Frontier Province, support for federalism meant support for greater Muslim cultural autonomy. In his History of the Arya Samaj, written during this period, Lajpat Rai explicitly reminded the Samaj of its duty towards an Indian nationalism above Hinduism, stating that, quote, "The Arya Samaj has to remember that the India of today is not exclusively Hindu. Its prosperity and future depends upon the reconciliation of Hinduism with the greater ism, Indian nationalism." End quote. Rai referred to the idea of India coalescing into a nation with one religion and one tongue as midsummer madness, and fantasies about reviving what he called the medieval idea of one people, one church as tyrannical. The world, he said, was now happily rid of such tyranny. Rai's turn towards this secular, pluralist, composite Indian nationalism was also reflected in his reinterpretation during the war years of India's medieval Muslim history. From having articulated the notion of Hindu resistance to the foreign Muslim enemy in previous years, Rai now undertook several measures to counter the portrayal of medieval India as a period of foreign Muslim rule marked by domination, oppression, and conflict. The period of so-called Muslim rule was reimagined as one involving socio-cultural interaction, political fairness, religious tolerance and concord between Hindus and Muslims, and even exemplifying virtuous Indian governance. So Rai stated that, quote, "It is not right to say that Muslim rule was foreign rule. The Muslim invaders were no doubt foreign in their origin, but as soon as they settled in India, they adopted the country, made it their home, married and raised their children there, and became sons of the soil. Akbar and Aurangzeb were as much Indians as are today the Mughals and Pathans. Sher Shah and Ibrahim Lodi were no more foreigners in India than were the descendants of William the Conqueror in England. When Timur and Nadir Shah attacked India, they attacked a kingdom ruled by Indian Muslims. They were as much the enemies of the Mohammedan rulers of India as of Hindus. Muslims who exercised political sovereignty in India were Indians by birth, marriage, and by death." End quote. Lajpat Rai also argued that, quote, "Even the most bigoted and orthodox Muslim ruler of India did not possess the kind of social pride and exclusiveness of the contemporary British ruler, and that under Sher Shah, Akbar, Jahangir, and Shah Jahan, Hindus were eligible for the highest offices. End quote. Muslims had contributed to the evolution of Indian culture, as evidenced in Urdu or Hindustani, which he called purely Indian. According to Rai, the policies of Muslim rulers, unlike the British, rather than exploiting India in the interests of a foreign country, benefited India. Rai also countered British portrayals of Muslim rule as tyrannical and violent, arguing that, quote, there was no authentic record of even Aurangzeb having ordered any general massacre of Hindus, end quote. He criticized Vincent Smith for suggesting that the Delhi sultans had made the public exercise of Hindu religion illegal and had treated it as a capital offense. And he questioned whether even Aurangzeb had ever seriously tried to overpower or outcast Hinduism. Lajpat Rai pointed out that while medieval times in Europe were marked by religious warfare and persecution, in India, the period of Muslim political sovereignty was marked by relative religious tolerance. By unearthing Lajpat Rai's wartime nationalist narrative, my research shows that whether or not Hindutva further developed the Hindu national ideas articulated by Lajpat Rai, his own Hindu nationalism gave way to a rich, distinctive, composite Indian nationalist narrative. Indeed, his new Indian nationalism led Rai, after his return to India in early 1920, to actively support the Khilafat movement led by Gandhi and a section of the Indian Muslim leadership. This movement aimed to preserve the boundaries of the Ottoman Caliphate Empire in the face of European plans to divide it up following Turkey's defeat in World War I. It also insisted that Islam's holy places must remain under the Ottoman Caliph's custody. Now, for Rai, Hindu-Muslim unity was both the foundation of Indian Swaraj and a moral and political principle to be pursued for its own sake. It had to be, quote, the first article of the political faith of Hindus and Muslims, end quote. So he urged Hindus to support their Muslim brothers on the Khilafat question. Because now, for Rai, Hindu-Muslim unity was central to the autonomy and identity of the Indian nation, he urged Hindus to support their Muslim brothers on the Khilafat question. Sorry, did I just repeat that? I think I repeated that. Sorry. Rai held that the dismantling of the Ottoman Empire and the removal of Islam's holy cities from the Ottoman Caliph's custody violated Islam and prevented Muslims from fulfilling their religious obligations. Rai urged Hindus to support the Khilafat cause as, quote, the trustees of Islam. Hindus had to support the issue even if it was a religious cause confined only to Muslims. Hindus and Muslims had to support each other's causes as members of the Indian nation. Then Hindus had to support the Khilafat question because any question affecting India's Muslims was automatically a national question for India's Hindus. Hindus had a duty to respect Muslim religious sentiments. Any offense to India's Muslims was an offense to India's Hindus. Moreover, in Rai's view, Britain broke its pledge that it would protect Islam's holy places and the Caliphate, a pledge on the condition of which it had obtained Indian military help in the war against Turkey. The breaking of this promise to Indians needed to be protested by Hindus and Muslim Indians. Rai countered Hindus who argued that pan-Islamism made Indian Muslims arrogant in their political negotiations with the British government and aloof from India and Hindus. Rai argued that the Khilafat cause had in fact made Muslims renounce their earlier aloofness and energized them into taking their rightful place in Indian nationalist politics. The pan-Islamism of Indian Muslims had encouraged their Indian nationalism. Rai also told Hindus that pan-Islamism was beneficial for them because Britain's irrational fears of pan-Islamism compelled it to treat Indians justly. For Rai, after the war, pan-Islamism was also part of his struggle against the Eurocentric imperial world order and his attempt to establish a world order of equal self-ruling nations. The Ottoman Empire was seen as a defensive fortress protecting Asia and India from further European imperial subjugation. The Muslim world with the Ottoman Caliphate at its head was seen as India's guardian ally against an increasingly imperialist Europe. and Indian Muslim sympathies with the Ottoman Caliphate Empire and the Muslim world were seen as compatible with their loyalty to the Indian nation. This was unlike Savarkarite Hindutva, which held that Muslim devotion to holy sites outside India and the existence of a Muslim world beyond it divided Muslim loyalty to India and posed a threat to Hindus. Lajpat Rai, on the other hand, asked Hindus, quote, "How long are we going to be afraid of shadows and be deceived of imaginary fears set before us as a justification of despotic rule?" End quote. For Rai, fears about pan-Islamism were a British creation to divide Hindus and Muslims. He urged Hindus to repose their trust in India's Muslims. India's freedom required complete trust between Hindus and Muslims. Contrary to what may be assumed about a supposed forefather of Hindutva, rather than expressing a Hindu nationalism fearful of Muslim religiosity and suspicious about their extraterritorial loyalties, Lajpat Rai's Indian nationalism urged Hindus to respect Muslim religious sentiments and sympathies towards the Ottoman Caliphate and Muslim world. It strove to promote trust between Hindus and Muslims. Clearly, pigeonholing Lajpat Rai's entire thought as Hindu nationalism has obscured a historical intellectual juncture when a Hindu political figure like him enthusiastically supported pan-Islamism as compatible with and even necessary for Indian nationalism. While scholarship on Hindu nationalism typically portrays the standard Hindu response to the Khilafat movement as one of fear and resentment, Lajpat Rai shows that this was not the sole Hindu response to the movement. Finally, this book seeks to challenge historical scholarship, which assumes that when, in the violent aftermath of the Khilafat movement's decline, Lajpat Rai joined and led the Hindu Mahasabha, he elaborated a Hindu communalism equivalent to Hindu nationalism. It shows that in the fourth and final phase of his life, in the mid-1920s, Lajpat Rai, as Mahasabha leader, elaborated yet another new and distinct Indian nationalist narrative. Rai now organized a militant Hindu politics aimed at mobilizing Hindu opposition to Muslim demands for separate electorates and communal representation, which he now, in the context of unprecedented serial rioting and polarization, saw as the root cause of Hindu-Muslim disunity. These, he now concluded, prevented the possibility of Indian national unity and therefore Indian national freedom. Because he saw it as preventing Indian disunity and continued unfreedom, Rai saw his Hindu politics as being in service of Indian nationalism. In fact, Rai opposed separate electorates and communal representation because he saw them as violating the secular preconditions necessary for forging a united Indian nation. According to Rai, in modern times marked by religious diversity, the mixing of religion and politics would inevitably lead to conflict, which was why the West had banished religion from politics, and in some cases even privatized religion, enabling individuals to unite as members of a common nation. India's religious diversity meant that Hindu laws could not form the basis of an Indian polity. Rai rejected Hindu theocracy or a state with Hinduism as the established privileged official religion as inappropriate for a religiously diverse India. However, since this diversity was causing conflict, India had to follow the West and separate religion from politics in order for Hindus and Muslims to unite as members of the Indian nation. As Mahasabha leader, Lajpat Rai aimed at establishing a radically secular state and politics free of all markers of religion as a crucial precondition for the foundation of a united, stable Indian nation. The militant Hindu politics he sought to engineer through the Mahasabha aimed at establishing precisely such a radically secular state and politics. While Rai sometimes dreamt of a secularism which even privatized religion, his secularism in fact came closer to the American wall of separation ideal of secularism. His vision of a secular Indian state would grant full religious liberty of belief, worship, propagation, association, and education as a constitutional right to all communities forming the Indian nation. No government funds would be devoted to any religious institutions or purposes. Much like the American secular ideal, the state would refrain from interfering in religion, whether to hinder or positively assist it, granting full religious freedom. Yet, as Mahasabha leader, Rai also remained willing to depart from this American-style secularism to concede reservations to the Muslim minority in proportion to their population if this was required for Indian national unity. This acknowledged Muslim minority fears of Hindu majoritarian domination. In fact, much of the fury of Lajpat Rai's Hindu politics was aimed at preventing the extension of Muslim communal representation beyond their numerical proportion in the population. The context of serial riots in the 1920s, the riot in the Kohat district of the Muslim-majority Northwest Frontier province, which was followed by Kohat's entire Hindu minority population being evacuated by the British government, the centrifugal tendencies and confusion that marked Indian politics following the Montagu-Chelmsford reforms, the unraveling of the 1916 Lucknow Pact agreed upon by the Congress and the Muslim League, and Lajpat Rai's own Hindu minority status in Muslim-majority Punjab, combined with a particular mental image of medieval Muslim rule, to produce in Rai fears that Muslim demands for increased adequate representation were possibly ploys to institute Muslim minority domination. Rai sought to engineer Hindu politics through the Hindu Mahasabha to keep communal representation within what he called reasonable limits. To be sure, Rai defined these limits in terms of Muslim representation in proportion to their numbers in India's population. Anything above that was seen to encroach upon the political rights of the Hindu majority. Rai's Hindu politics and his secularism was attached to the notion of a Hindu majority, which had to be defended, even violently if necessary. Rai's secularism played its role in preventing the expansion of Muslim political rights. From the more trust-based and other-embracing secular Indian nationalism Rai articulated during the Khilafat movement, in the mid-1920s, he moved to a more distrustful, hardline secular Indian nationalism, explicitly hostile to contemporary Muslim political demands. His vehement opposition to them shows that a move from a Hindu nation-based narrative to a secular Indian nationalist one doesn't always involve a move towards a politics more accommodative towards Muslim demands. Yet Rai's secularism was not based on a desire for Hindu majority domination. This is evident when he stated that, quote, "To the Hindus I will say, if there are any among you who still dream of a Hindu Raj in this country, who think that they can crush the Mussalmans and be the supreme power in this land, tell them that they are fools, or to be more accurate, that they are insane, and that their insanity will ruin their Hinduism along with their country." End quote. Rai's secularism did not privilege Hinduism as state religion. Granting inclusive citizenship, it held that every human being born in India or of Indian parents, or who has made India his or her home, is a compatriot, regardless of color, creed, caste, or vocation. It supported the Nehru Report's grant of equal citizenship, defining a citizen as every person who was born and whose father was either born or naturalized within the territorial limits of the Commonwealth. Religion was delinked from citizenship. Rai's secularism granted religious freedom to all and advocated Hindustani rather than Hindi as India's national language. It also still envisioned a federal state granting substantial autonomy to India's Muslim-majority provinces. Rai's eventual consideration of Jinnah's Delhi proposals and his active support for the 1928 Nehru Report reveals his willingness to consider the reservation of something between 1/3 and 1/4 seats for Muslims at the center, showing his openness to political mechanisms that could check Hindu majoritarianism. As a Hindu Mahasabha leader, Rai did not articulate Hindutva dreams of Hindu supremacy, but explicitly opposed fantasies of Hindu Raj as ruinous of Hinduism and India. Rai's vision of a secular Indian nation state was aimed at through a militant Hindu politics. And yet his secularism was not reducible to Hindu majoritarianism. It continued to hold positive significance for minorities. But equally, and this is important, Rai's secular communal position was ultimately an untenable one. His Hindu communalism threatened to undermine his own secularism, rendering it unstable and fragile. To conclude, this book is of course not just about one man and his ideas. It uses Lajpat Rai's thought to make broader analytical arguments. One about the need to recognize internal differentiation within Hindu nationalism. Not all Hindu nationalisms are the same as Hindutva. Second, about the need to allow for shifts and fluidity within a politician thinker's ideas. People's ideas can change in response to changing political and intellectual contexts. We need to pay close attention to how they change, why, and what this means. And finally, Hindu politics and a vision of secular Indian nationalism and secularism can be expressed together and share ground. But this does not necessarily nullify the meaning and integrity of that secular vision, reducing it to a ploy for Hindu majority domination. While often the secular sounding language of separating religion and politics is used instrumentally to conceal ideological projects of majority domination, and in fact go against secularism's core aim of opposing interreligious domination, in some cases one can have an insecure Hindu politics seeking to establish a secularism which rests on an attachment to the Hindu majority but still opposes dreams of Hindu supremacy and domination, rejects the notion of the state privileging Hinduism and Hindus, emphasizes equal citizenship regardless of religion, which respects diversity and can even consider Muslim political reservations. At the same time, such militant politics has a bearing on that secular vision, rendering it unstable. Hindu politics and secularism cannot be expressed together easily or for long. In the end, one must destroy the other. A hyphenated secular communal position is an untenable one since Hindu communalism threatens to undermine core secular values such as peace, tolerance, and fraternity. So while my research agrees with revisionist scholarship, which rejects assumptions of mutual exclusivity between Hindu majoritarian communal politics on one hand and secular Indian nationalism and secularism on the other, I wish to strongly push back against current scholarly tendencies to virtually conflate these categories, reading secularism as little more than thinly veiled Hindu majoritarian domination, the Hindu majoritarian communalism. Rai's untenable hyphenated secular communal position shows that we must continue to retain analytical distinctions between secularism and Hindu majoritarian communalism. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Vanya, for this very rich presentation and also for bringing out the nuances of your research with such great clarity. Um, I would now invite Professor Sagnik Gupta to discuss Vanya's book. Sagnik.
Thank you, Vanya, for that very rich presentation. And it was a delight to read this extremely eloquently written book. And thank you, Gagan and Ideas team, for this invitation. So I will, because Vanya has already laid out her arguments in great detail, so it doesn't make sense to just rehash those arguments. What I'll try to do in my remarks is make sense of what she's doing in terms of her methodology, which I found quite interesting, and also maybe pick out some themes which we can discuss a bit further. So to start with, I mean, just a little bit of a caveat that I'm not a historian, and it's good to kind of spell that out. So I come at it from a political theorist's point of view, and I mean, my own work is at the intersection of political theory and anthropology, and of course, like I do dabble in South Asian history occasionally. So I was reading it as someone who's interested in these concepts and the lived life of ideas and so on. So what I find to be an important contribution of this book is the way in which it lays out the relationship between political concepts and political action, and the richness of detail helps us understand how particular historical contingencies shape political thinking in particular moments in South Asian history. And this is really a very rich way of doing intellectual history, because intellectual history as a tradition has conventionally focused on certain Eurocentric figures. And if one looks at the canon of Western European intellectual history, it's very focused on thinkers who are self-consciously theorizing about the state and sovereignty and so on. Whereas when one is looking at a context like India or South Asia, some of our political thinkers, I mean, it's Indian intellectual history or South Asian intellectual history and political thought is still a very nascent field. And within this field, some of the figures that we are working with are figures who are also, I mean, they're not just political thinkers, but they're also very self-consciously involved and engaged in political action. So this kind of, it was really, I think, interesting to see this interaction between political concepts and political action, and the book kind of very seamlessly weaves these two different worlds and gives us a sense of how um, there are certain moments that are shaped by the contingency of political action, and Hindu nationalism being one of them, and also the idea of community itself and the kind of historical changes that it undergoes, the meaning of communalism and what it stands for at a particular point in history, and how it undergoes a transformation and becomes sort of antithetical to an idea of secular nationalism in Lajpat Rai's trajectory was I think it was kind of treated with remarkable care in the book. So one of the I think the Khilafat movement is, of course, like this key conjunctural moment that the book talks about. And it was very interesting to see the way in which the Khilafat movement was interpreted and understood by Vanya, and as initially as an anti-colonial movement where there is a sort of transnational solidarity against European colonialism. And in a lot of scholarship on the Khilafat movement, we read a lot about, Hindu-Muslim solidarity, and I mean, Gandhi has been the more central figure who has been talked about in relation to the scholarship on the Khilafat movement. But it was really interesting to see someone who has been read as some sort of a proto-Hindu nationalist figure, and how they understood the Khilafat movement as primarily an anti-colonial an anti-colonial movement where there was a possibility for transnational solidarity against European colonialism, and also Vanya kind of traces the point at which um, Lajpat Rai's relationship to the Khilafat movement undergoes a transformation because of the skepticism and fear about the upsurge of global Islam. So that was, I mean, that's one example of how political theory and political action speak to each other, and the concept of the community and the concept of nationalism itself is shaped by these historical contingencies, as it were. Secondly, I mean, the one question that I thought it is treated with a lot of care in the book, but it didn't come up enough in the presentation, was the question of caste. And I think the book makes an important contribution in also treating the nuances of the relationship between Hinduism, Hindutva, and the caste question, because the chapters that are devoted to a discussion of how the Sanatanists and Arya Samajists are treating the caste question differently, even within the fold of Hinduism, if we understand Hinduism broadly as an umbrella term. So I found that observation very striking, where you note that there was this kind of vertical understanding of conversion, where caste is kind of, conversion is something that doesn't lead you necessarily to forego your caste identity, but even though there is this kind of consolidation of a Hindu identity. So that is the kind of Sanatanist understanding of conversion, as opposed to an understanding of conversion where there is a possibility of a more horizontal kind of solidarity between different communities. So it was, I think, very nicely brought out in the chapter. So, and that is where I have one question about how did Lajpat Rai's relationship to caste change through the 1920s? Maybe this is something you have addressed in the book already, but this is something that doesn't, to me, it would probably merit some more discussion, and especially in the backdrop of this changing relationship with the idea of Hindu representation. So you have taken a lot of effort to spell out how his relationship to Hindu representation changes, and he's talking about communal representation. And also, you have spelled out with a lot of care how his position is different than the Hindu nationalist position on Hindu representation, because he's still, up until the end, he's talking about an Indian nation. And even when he is talking about the need for Hindu representation, it is different than kind of foregrounding this kind of an idea of Hindu sovereignty where Hinduism is kind of consolidated as some sort of a state religion. So you've spelled that out with a lot of care, but I was just left asking a little bit that how caste figures in that in that story, and that is, I think that it would be interesting to discuss that a little bit, because there is a very interesting narrative, and there's a very engaging story about the gradual consolidation of both a Hindu political identity and a Muslim political identity through the 20th century. And I think just a couple of, we were just having a chat about Amar's book, and Amar's book beautifully brings out this consolidation of a Muslim identity and how there was an attempt at carving out this space for a secular Muslim nationalism and a secular Muslim identity. And whereas your book is giving us that story about Hinduism, that how there were tensions within this idea of a consolidated Hindu identity, and how there were conceptions of Hinduism that were different than this Hindu nationalist identity, which kind of resides in an idea of sovereignty and in an idea of Hindu culture, that is exclusionary. So this is so these were some comments, and uh, in terms of the changing configuration of community, or the category of the community, and I think that is again something that is traced with a lot of care and in a lot of detail about how the idea of community is changing in the rhetoric of representation, where Lajpat Rai draws a distinction between nationalism and communalism, but also ultimately wants a secular Indian nationalism of some form, despite his being quite vocal about Hindu representation. And you argue, and you've argued in the book, and you also argued it in great detail in your presentation, that ultimately Rai's nationalism, Lajpat Rai's nationalism, was respectful of diversity. So that's where I have one question, which is that, what are the limitations of this conception of nationalism, and in the current political context that we're in, what is the balance of this kind of nationalism? Because the politics of diversity also comes with certain kind of power differential between the majority and the minority community. So in that context, is there a risk of that conception of a politics of nationalism feeding easily into the Hindu rights politics? So that's one question that I had. And also, I was quite struck by the fact that he was so insistent on Hindustani as India's national language. Now, again, linguistic nationalism has been a sort of blind spot, if one could put it like that, within the secular Indian nationalist project as well, because we have like the debates around linguistic representation and the reorganization of states and so on that is happening immediately after independence. And it's not by any means a resolved question to this day that, what should be the national language? Should there be a national language or not? So that is one place where I felt like, it does point maybe to some sort of a limitation of this idea of respectful diversity and so on, that there is an insistence on a national language, and how does that square with linguistic diversity in the nation, and so on. And finally, I had some thoughts on how you characterize secularism, and especially in the final chapter where you're talking a lot about um, kind of drawing out this distinction between American style Western secularism, where there is a clear demarcation between the church and the state, and between the kind of secularism that Lajpat Rai is talking about, which is more accommodative of communities and community representation, and so on. So I just that is where I just wanted to push you a little bit in terms of the characterization of Western or American secularism also as um, having this kind of a complete divide between the church and the state. If that is actually the case, and a lot of the critical scholarship on secularism talks about secular power as very closely tethered to state sovereignty and so on. So it's not really a complete divide between the church and the state, because the state is still in the kind of driver's seat in terms of also defining what religion is, how this separation will be enacted between the church and the state. It requires also compartmentalizing and defining religion in particular ways. So to that extent, I was wondering if there is, and there are some overlaps with Indian secularism broadly understood, because again, Lajpat Rai is talking about all of these ideas of community representation and Hindu representation, Muslim representation, and so on. And these are not categories that are self-evident, as you yourself have phrased. So the state is still in kind of quite involved in regulating and defining the boundaries of religion, and in sort of the definition of religion and the demarcation of communities is a process that is not divorced entirely from state power. And that is, in a way, that sort of that's analogous with the way in which secularism works in a Western, if we understand the West very broadly, but we're really talking about American secularism. So these are like my few comments. But again, thank you so much for this opportunity, and I think it's a really rich book which has already generated a lot of discussion, and I'm sure it will give us a lot of food for thought. Thank you.
Thank you, Sagnik, for your comments on the book. Vanya, would you first like to respond to Sagnik before I read out to you Soumya's comments?
Anything, I'm okay with anything. You can read out Soumya's also. Then I
Okay,
can.
so let me first read out Soumya's comments on the book, and first probably you can take them together, and then we
Yeah.
can have more questions. Just a minute. So Soumya says, I want to begin by congratulating Vanya on this excellent book. I loved reading it, and the topic is immensely interesting. She says, I would like to begin at the very beginning with the author's notes, where you make a strong case for writing public histories. This appears especially important given that history is so contested in India presently. We have seen attempts to recover, reframe figures, particularly Hindu nationalist figures, and rework their relationship with the national movement, with colonialism, and also with secularism. You discuss this in significant detail in part 4 of your book, where you talk about serving secularism, Indian nationalist rhetoric, also about Lajpat Rai's Hindu politics and his secularism. So her first question is, in what in what ways do you think your history of secularism and religion challenge the secular versus religious divide as two oppositional positions in contemporary Indian discourse? I think some of it you already answered, but uh, your second question is about the text related to sources. So she says it would be great if you could talk us through the process of writing this book. What really got you interested in the subject? Why Lala Lajpat Rai as a figure through whom you want to understand Hindu nationalism and the nation state? In your book, you emphasize and argue convincingly that Lajpat Rai is often appropriated by the Hindu nationalists as one of the early proponents of Hindutva, an ideology that was later built upon by Savarkar, but you choose to focus more on the discontinuities in their political thought and demonstrate a pretty significant difference in their overall vision and treatment of minorities. But you also warn the reader about not allowing him to be appropriated by a secular or a Congress narrative. What were the particular sources you would point a reader to if they were to explore this difference and this heterogeneity in Hindu nationalist political thought and ideas of nationhood? What was your experience in the archives? And I can see that you have accessed a lot of his private papers. what was really the process of putting together these primary sources, especially given the restrictions we have all faced in gaining access. So, to summarize, this question is about Lala Lajpat Rai's theoretical position on religion and secularism and the sources from which he draws. Lastly, her final question is about Rai's relationship to caste. You do introduce it as one of the subplots in the introduction itself, but also in chapter 9 of the book. But since the book follows a broad chronology, I'm wondering if Rai engaged differently with the caste question in caste question later in his career, especially after joining the Hindu Mahasabha. Does he seem like someone who is ideologically closer to a figure like Rajendra Prasad or Purushottam Das Tandon, even K.M. Munshi, whose ideas feature so prominently in the Constituent Assembly debates, and they remain figures who are difficult to box under ideological labels? You also mentioned that Rai was a pragmatic politician more than a theorist. How does that interact with the kind of debate on caste that we see develop later in the national movement, with Gandhi and Ambedkar, among others, centering so much of their writing and their politics on caste question? So I let you first take these comments, Vanya, before we have more questions.
Yeah, thank you so much to everyone who read the book so closely and for this very rich set of comments by both Sagnik and Soumya. I think I'll start maybe with a caste question since both of you asked the same question. So yeah, there is a difference in the second intellectual phase of his life when he's quite radical on caste, and the Hindu Mahasabha phase in the 1920s. So in the earlier phase, he's kind of attacking very explicitly birth-based, a birth-based caste hierarchy. He's arguing for the right to read the Vedas for everyone, not just Brahmins. This is, of course, the Arya Samaji influence coming through, and then he's talking about how nobody should be considered permanently an outcast because the fall of a person has come out of non-performance of rights, and it's very easily rectifiable through shuddhi. So he's arguing for to give the sacred thread to all lower castes and untouchables, which earlier in historical scholarship had been considered very it's a very nominal change. It doesn't really mean any significant change in a person's caste status, or it's just naam ke vaste. But it's been argued recently by C.S. Adcock that it actually did lead to a very significant, change in the status of a lower caste, so-called lower caste or untouchable person, and did change in the lived relations between castes. So a lot of lower castes and untouchable individuals did approach the Arya Samaj precisely for this reason, because they saw it as part of the ritual politics of caste, and it did have a radical element to it. And he very strongly also is arguing for the education of so-called untouchables, because he believes that this is how leaders will come up from within this community, and that is required to challenge the prejudice. The arrogance is what he calls of the upper castes. He refers to, I mean, he's very radical in his words in this earlier phase. 1909 to 1915 is when he's really writing a lot on the depressed classes and on so-called untouchables, and likens the upper caste to slave owners in a manner kind of reminiscent of Phule. Of course, all of this is happening within the frame of a Hindu community or a Hindu nation, as he sometimes calls it, but he's very explicit in attacking what he calls the cruelty and the shocking unjust practices. And he also talks about how caste taboos they're a creation. They weren't there before. And so he attacks, taboos on marriage, on living, on interdining. In the 1920s, his main focus really shifts to um, consolidating this Hindu Sangathan as a way to project display this Hindu community, which is strong in negotiations with the British and the Muslim, political leaders. So with this in mind, he is really now become pragmatic to come to Soumya's question on the caste question. And even if he's personally, you can see that personally he's still quite radical, but he's kind of appeasing the Sanatanist Orthodox Hindu position. But you can see the conflict in him also, because at times he's also kind of castigating them for raising the cry of, religion in danger. But on the whole, he is kind of retreating and becoming more conservative on caste, and he's really quite intolerant towards the overt caste politics that is now beginning to emerge through MC Raja, through Ambedkar specifically, and he kind of really dismisses it as, these are hired agents of the British, or at least they are playing into the hands of the Muslims who want to divide the Hindu community and fracture it. At a time when he thinks that Hindu Sangathan is the path to make sure that the Hindu majority has a just, enters into a just political pact with the Muslim political leaders who are asking for what he thinks is more than their share, which is in proportion to their numbers in the population. He thinks that caste politics goes totally against the grain of what is required. So yeah. So Lajpat Rai is a figure who doesn't always, or most of the times, the movement in his ideas is not linear. It's kind of zigzag. And you see that in the caste, his approach to caste quite a lot. The next question was, I think, yeah, the limits, I would say the lapsing into, the fear and the prejudice that he lapses into, often because he's a Hindu minority figure in Muslim majority Punjab, but also I think these are tropes which are also coming from the Arya Samaji worldview. So I would say, and the attachment to a Hindu majority, a strong attachment to it, which is strong enough to make it explicit. I mean, Nehru might have assumed a Hindu majority, but Lajpat Rai makes it quite explicit in his politics, and this urge to defend it even violently from this threat of the Muslim, which is trying to encroach upon it. I think that can sometimes go against the grain of what he himself envisions as the ideal of a future India, where these identities are not the most prominent identities. And then, as I said, I think, yeah, his militant Hindu politics is in tension with his vision of a secular Indian nation. So I think Lajpat Rai shows to us that, I mean, I would not say still that this is instrumental, that, there's a Hindu politics beneath his, his kind of pretense over secularism. He seems to be, this is the kind of internal inconsistency within political or politician thinkers like him. And I would say that is a real limit of his politics, this kind of tension, which doesn't get resolved even until the end. And then, yeah, I think your question about secularism, yeah, I would say he has bought that larger kind of critique of secularism would stand, I think. And Lajpat Rai is working within that frame of, there is a state, there is a domain called religion. He himself is also kind of partaking in constantly tailoring religion himself to suit his political ends sometimes, or, at least his community building ends. Whether that's, seen in the cultural domain or the social domain or the political domain. So he's operating within that framework of an accepted, religious, the secular frame of, there's a political domain, religious domain. But within that, I would say there are different conceptions, ideals of secularism. And he comes closer to the American ideal, where, this strict wall is maintained, and religious freedom is given a lot of importance. Equal citizenship is given importance, and at some points he's willing to concede the breach of this wall to give Muslim political rights, but again within certain limits, because for him the Muslims are a minority, and any representation above the numbers is kind of a violation of secularism, a violation of democracy. For him, that is how he sees it. But within that frame, he's willing to give the Muslim minority their rights according to their numbers in the population. What was I think Soumya's question was similar to this one, but the one on Why Lajpat Rai? I think for me, I was an undergraduate student who was very interested in the kind of threat to the secular Indian constitution from this other ideology and this kind of constant struggle that one could see even before on, the two different ways of defining nationhood and the relationship between identity and nationhood. So I was interested in Savarkar initially, but then I realized that a lot of work has been done on Savarkar. I'm not very conversant with Marathi also, so I need to look at maybe another figure. And I had a similar view of Lajpat Rai, so that is why I got interested in Lajpat Rai, and there were these 15 volumes of his collected works. So to answer Soumya's question, I thankfully did not have to go into various buildings to collect all the sources. Some very nice individuals had already done that, and there are these very fat books. I can show them to you. They're lined over here. 15 volumes of 400 pages each, but untapped. So I got interested. I was flipping through them, and then what interested me was precisely this, that how is this person who is considered a forefather of Hindutva supporting the Khilafat movement? Like this doesn't add up. So what does that mean? So then I kind of got interested in the fluidity of his thought also. So what does that mean for, how sometimes we can also fix people into certain categories and people are kind of, not fitting in exactly. So you need to really pay attention to the texture and the nuances and the fluidity. Take it seriously, even if it's more challenging, even if it's a headache and it's a pain to kind of take into account every kind of change and shift and inconsistency. But to try and square that, I think became the challenge for me. And to kind of grapple with that question of what does that mean then for intellectual history and political thought. Is political thought only, Hobbes who writes a treatise, or Gandhi who writes a Hind Swaraj and is, systematic in that way, or Tagore who is much more self-conscious in the way he writes, or can we do an intellectual history of a figure who is in the thick of politics and really engaging and responding to various other political players, various other events, global context, Indian context, personal context. So that was, I think that's my grip. I think, and then I don't know enough about Rajendra Prasad and P.D. Tandon, K. Munshi. I would say that if they are people who are difficult to box, then yes, he's similar to them. But I think we need to really start exploring the nuances and the texture of all these thinkers much more in order for us to also have a better democratic dialogue and conversation. Because if we're slotting everyone into one, then we are not really understanding the complexity of what's happening. And we need to grapple with how a Lajpat Rai could be friends with socialist intellectuals and with W.E.B. Du Bois, people like that, and then also be part of the Hindu Mahasabha. And that, I think, maybe we have not done enough of that. And that's also how we reached where we reached. Yeah.
Thank you, Vanya, for responding to the questions. We have very little time left because the session is supposed to be till 4:30. I would quickly read out to you Shashank's question. Did Savarkar ever claim the position of Lajpat Rai as a proponent of proto-Hindutva, or is it merely a sourceless inference of the contemporary right wing to usurp Rai's legacy? The very fact that Bhagat Singh formed the Naujawan Sabha to avenge the death of Lala Lajpat Rai and kill Saunders establishes that Lajpat Rai's political stand was anything but that in sync with Savarkar's version of being Hindu, given the ideological belief of Bhagat Singh. So he wants you to comment on that. So I will also quickly ask my question, because we have been
Yes.
talking on the cast, and we get various references in your books about how Lajpat Rai is challenging caste taboos. He also challenges the birth privileges of Brahman. At the same time, he is also reading sacred texts like the Manusmriti. So my question to you is that um, does he selectively then read the sacred texts, or how is he able to reconcile what he reads and the reality, the caste reality? So these two questions quickly, and we will close the session.
Yeah, so I would imagine that that Savarkar, if he does appropriate Lajpat Rai, then it is done selectively and without understanding the nuance of the person that he is appropriating. Because if you read Hindutva and even Savarkar's later texts and his statements, they are very different from Lajpat Rai's ideas of Hindu nationhood. Even when Lajpat Rai, as I said, articulated his most robust idea of a Hindu nation, it still is not demanding that Muslims and Christians give up their religions and their culture to assimilate into Hindu culture, and they can only be part of the Hindu nation, which is the nation in India, if they do that. So there's a very clear kind of in Lajpat Rai, this demand is just not there. For him, diversity is such a given that he would not think of making this kind of a assimilationist demand, and he's not as averse to diversity as Savarkar is at all. Bhagat Singh also has an interesting intellectual relationship with Lajpat Rai, I think, because he's inspired by Lajpat Rai's. I mean, Chris Moffat has written about how Bhagat Singh was inspired by Lajpat Rai's library. He was educated in the National College founded by Lajpat Rai. I think the anti-colonial bent in him is somewhat influenced by the same kind of thinking. But by the 1920s, actually, Bhagat Singh is quite, he's in strong disagreement with Lajpat Rai. And he apparently distributes this pamphlet titled The Lost Leader, Lupt Neta, about Lajpat Rai, who's gone over to the Hindu communal side. But then this makes it all the more interesting that Bhagat Singh still decides to avenge Lajpat Rai's death. So that's, statue of an anti-colonial, this leader. And genuinely, Lajpat Rai has that, anti-imperial legacy. So yeah, there's overlaps, but there are also differences between Lajpat Rai and Bhagat Singh too. Yeah, I think Lajpat Rai often kind of sprinkles quotations from texts, Rig Veda, Tharva Veda, Manusmriti, but these are ultimately quite selective readings and for a very kind of pointed political end. Whatever end he wants to use it for, in that moment, he kind of picks up these texts and tailors it to that purpose. Yeah.
So this brings us to the close of the session. I would again like to congratulate Vanya and thank you everyone who managed to join this meeting. Thank you once again, Sagnik, for discussing the book, and hopefully we have more occasions to talk about your book, Vanya. Thanks a
Thank
lot.
you. Thank you so much for having me, for organizing it and the event, and also for such a close reading of the book and a very rich set of comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Vanya. Thank you.
Thank you.